What's up, enthusiasts, and welcome to the second installment of our Q&A series. I am loving this series so far, so let's jump right in. This week there were a couple questions that I wanted to address, both on a similar topic. Now, both Nerf is Great and Randomonium asked questions regarding adhesives and epoxies when modding. There's also a question about painting, but we'll cover that another time. I want to focus on the roles of each common adhesive in Nerf modding. Now, I could attempt to answer this for you, but I would be doing you a disservice. So I brought in one of the best modders around to answer this question for all of you. That would be Tom of FDS, and if you haven't seen his work, you're missing out. He's incredibly knowledgeable on this topic, so I'm going to let him handle this question.
Hi, it's Tom here from FDS, and I've been asked to guest in with Jangular this week. So thanks to Jangular. This is a Q&A, and the question I've been asked to talk about is adhesives and fillers and general epoxies for Nerf use. So we're going to start at the top of the tree with structural adhesive, and adhesive is very different to filler. Filler is what you use to bridge gaps. Adhesive is what you use to join parts, and we are starting with DevCon Plastic Welder. Now, there are other brands of plastic welder available. Loctite make one, and I think there are a couple of other US brands. I'm sure we can get some information for those. But what you're looking for with plastic welder is monomer methacrylate as the active ingredient, and we shorten that to MMA. An MMA adhesive actually fuses the plastic by welding it together. It's kind of like a solvent weld, except it is also a gap filler. So sometimes those are described as an epoxy because they're mixed from two tubes. But strictly speaking, they're a plastic welder, and that is the key phrase you look at when buying those. Now, those are capable of holding very big loads. They're a good structural adhesive. You can use them for butt joints and fillet joints in plastic. A fillet joint with a plastic is when you'll have an overlapping joint where you may have a piece of backing material behind the joint, where it's a stepped joint like this. So that would be a fillet joint, and a butt joint is when you just butt the two pieces up against each other, flat end on. Now, you'll see a lot of butt joining in integrations, and personally, I like to make that into a fillet joint by increasing the glue surface area using a styrene or a PVC, or even better, an ABS backing plastic. Just buy some sheet ABS, normally fairly thin, and use that to increase your glue surface area. Combine that with a plastic welder, and that will give you a really strong joint. So the next thing down the tree is traditional polyester epoxy. So those are sold often under the Araldite type brands. You have a number of different epoxies made by many different adhesive companies. Now, generally with polyester epoxy, the slower the cure time, the stronger the bond. If you accelerate the drying time of polyester epoxies, you tend to compromise their overall strength. Now, the downside about a polyester epoxy as compared to a MMA adhesive is that it does not actually melt the plastic. What it does is it bonds to the surface of the plastic. So it's not actually fusing itself with the plastic, it's just attaching to it. So that's why normally when you use an epoxy, you should roughen the surface. I roughen the surface for all my adhesive joints, even when I'm using MMA. But you don't have to with MMA because it actually melts the first layer of plastic and softens it. Particularly works well with ABS. Epoxy doesn't do this. So with an epoxy joint, you really must roughen the area that you're going to use. Our epoxy is suitable for some things that you cannot do with MMA. One of the things that you can only do with an epoxy is to bond brass. Now, because of the nature of brass and how it oxidizes, it is not compatible with MMA adhesives. Steel is, and to a lesser extent, aluminium. So doing things like bonding bolt sled plates onto long shot bolt sleds, if you're buying the aluminium plates from somebody like Hobby Mods, those do bond well with an MMA. But if you're constructing a brass breech, or you're making a sleeper breech, or you're doing anything where you're going to bond brass to plastic, then you're going to need a slow cure epoxy. And for that, there is not much better than the really slow curing epoxies. Araldite's the most common one. There are numerous other super strength slow cure epoxies, and those are 24-hour curing time, and you must not rush those. You've got to leave them. You must get the part set up right and in the right place, and then you've got to just leave it to cure. So there's no real shortcuts to that really high strength epoxy bond. Now, next thing down the tree in terms of adhesives isn't strictly an adhesive, it's a putty. A lot of people say, yeah, man, I bonded with Epoxy Putty. And I see that a lot. Epoxy putty is not truly an adhesive. You can get epoxy putties that have adhesive qualities, but they are basically a polyester resin. Normally, you can have reinforced ones like chemical metal or plasteel and similar ones. And what those are is a polyester resin, and they have stranded polymer weave in them. So the stranded polymer actually reinforces the putty and makes it a little bit harder. Now, those have the advantage of being drillable, and you can tack them. And they will hold a thread. Some of the really heavily fiber reinforced putties will hold threads. However, they are not a structural adhesive, in my opinion, and shouldn't be considered as such. So they're very useful if you have a large gap to bridge and you haven't made up a piece of sheet material to put behind it. Or if you have a join where you've got a curve, and you have a join on a curve, it can be very hard to make a plastic part to fit in there, even if you have some heat bending equipment. So those are the kind of places where maybe an epoxy putty is more useful than some other glues, although often an MMA will bridge gaps up to about 4 millimeters, 3-4 millimeters. You can actually get an MMA adhesive to bridge that gap. So epoxy putty, handy for some things. One of the things I like to use it for is a support adhesive. So if you, for example, if you followed Nom's 83K guide, there's a plastic part that he puts inside, a little polycarbonate part that he puts inside to support the rotation mechanism inside the 83K, and it's a cut piece of polycarbonate, and you have to bond it to the outside of the shell with a simple butt joint. And your glue surface area again is very small in a butt joint like that, where you're just going flat on. So epoxy putty around both sides can be really good to support that glue joint. So that's what I recommend using epoxy putties for. If you are going for an epoxy putty and you want the maximum strength, then look for a fiber reinforced one. Usually they have steel in the name, and those generally are stronger. Again, those are very slow curing. They're 12 to 24-hour cure times on those. You can get accelerated ones, but like all polyester resins, they generally don't set as tough in the long run if they're accelerated. And very few of the fiber reinforced ones have accelerants in them. So the next glue we go on to is a cyanoacrylate adhesive, or super glue. And those are sold under a variety of different names, Gorilla Glue and Loctite, all the traditional super glues. And there are several different constituent types of those. You have a liquid cyanoacrylate, and then you have gel-based cyanoacrylates. Gel-based cyanoacrylates have a longer setting time. So those give you what we call wiggle room, where you can move the part around a little bit before it bonds fully. Now, cyanoacrylates have the advantage of being very fast setting. You can also get accelerants for super glue. I like to just go and buy a mitre fast pen, which is used in woodwork to accelerate the bonding of mitering joints on things like coving and architrave and all that kind of stuff. And those are really good. They're cheap. They last for ages. I use super glues for things like quick bonding of plastic parts. So if you have two small 3D printed parts that you want to join together that aren't going to be under massive structural load, or you're attaching a micro switch, for example, to a plate, then that's a very good job for super glue. And you can just use a thin film. Don't put too much on. The more you put on, the longer it will take to glue. And in some cases, it will produce white fumes from the glue, which I'm sure you've all seen if you've watched any of the old Beverly Hills Cop film. There's a great sequence where they do a street cop trick of lifting prints using the fumes from super glue. So if you want to avoid white marks on your components, don't use too much. And generally, gel super glues don't leave that hazing. So super glue has its place, and very useful for small parts and for quick bonds of non-structural things. And also it does accelerate the drying of some other adhesives. So you can put a little bit around, for example, an epoxy or an MMA, and that will then set quicker. But it does compromise that structural integrity. And the final type of glue is the modder's friend. It is hot glue. Now, hot glue is a interesting one because it's been a modding staple for many years, and there were many great proponents of the mighty hot glue back in the day, and it's been used for a variety of different things. Now, it does have its place in the hobby. It's a very useful adhesive because it sets very quickly and it sets quite hard, and you can squeeze it into cavities. However, it's not a structural glue. Much as we would all like to be able to squirt a really hard glue out of a convenient little gun that you could just then stick together and leave, and it would be done. This just doesn't happen. It's kind of one of the immutable laws of physics that you can't have super strength without super patience. So if you're an impatient sort of person, then hot glue is really not going to make the strongest bonds. However, The advantages of hot glue are that it is very easy to remove. All you do to remove hot glue is warm it up. So if you're making something and you want to pin things in place, you should consider hot glue to be kind of like tack welding if you're a welder, or a temporary adhesive that you can use to tack things together. I often use it when I'm doing an integration, for example, if I want to hold the parts in place so I can see how it's going to fit together, and I can check all the fit for later on for butt joints and things together, or for making fillet joints where I want to see how much gap I'm going to have behind, and then I can work out how big my fillet piece has got to be, or whether there's actual physical room inside the shell for components. So if you're doing integrations, it's very useful for that. And also, it's extremely handy for supporting electronic components. If you're holding in LEDs, for example, or you are tacking in place wiring within your shell, it's really handy for that, because at a later date, if you want to take any of that out, you heat the hot glue up a little bit with a hairdryer and you can just peel the components out and it comes apart really simply. So hot glue, ideal for tack joins, holding electronics, pinning things in place, and test fitting components. Not ideal for high strength structural joins, a replacement for things like epoxy putty. It doesn't take filler very well. So if you're trying to use it to gap fill, just be aware that if you're going to put Bondo or any type of polyester filler over the top, it really won't stick. So it has some distinct disadvantages versus proper glues. So hopefully that is the basics, and there are other adhesives you can use in Nerf. There are things like solvent weld. You can use acetone to melt the ABS as a form of solvent welding. Personally, I don't like having acetone in the house. It's a very strong solvent. If you get it in your eye, you are talking big burns to your eyes. We used to use it at work for cleaning stainless steels, and it really is not something you should play with. So I don't recommend acetone simply because it's extremely dangerous and it's very, very thin. It's very easy to spill. Similarly, if you are using something like MEC, which is another solvent welder, that's sold by Slater's as MEC Pack, and I can't remember the correct chemical name for MEC, but if you're using MEC, it comes in quite a big bottle, and if you spill that stuff, it's like thinner Armageddon. It's not nice. So if you're using MEC and you're using it, for example, for laminating layers of plastic sheet, it's extremely worthwhile decanting it into a small bottle and applying it with an old brush. So get yourself a small glass bottle, like a cheap airbrush bottle. They're really good. You can get them off eBay for suction airbrushes, and they're less than $5 each. And it's worth having those, or very, very small glass jars, and just put a small quantity of MEC in. And then when you're finished, dispose of it safely. Don't pour it down the drain. It's really bad for the environment. Similarly, acetone, if you must use it, I don't know why you would want to, don't leave large containers open because it fumes. It's also highly flammable. So those are some solvents, and we don't recommend the use of solvents. I certainly don't, because of the dangers of using those. Now, many adhesives contain solvents, but particularly those thin solvent-based plastic welding type adhesives should be used with caution.
There you have an awesome primer on what materials to use for the mod at hand. Thank you so much, Tom, for taking the time to help answer this question. If you haven't checked out his work on the Foam Data Services channel, there's a link both on the screen and in the info on this channel. He's got a lot of guides and some amazing showcase videos for his work that is well worth checking out, as he is one of the absolute best out there. So go do that. And don't forget as well to post your questions for the next video. I look forward to reading them. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Have fun flinging foam, and I'll see you next time.